Welcome, everyone. I am Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSE as a part of ASCB's Professional Development webinar series. Our facilitator, Kong Wang, will introduce our featured author for this installment of Online with LSE. Kong, you can turn your camera on now.
Thank you so much, Ashanti, for getting us started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Online with LSE webinar. My name is Kong Wang. I'm a postdoc research fellow at the University of Michigan. I'm glad to moderate today's webinar, which is about a featured LSE study, Diversity Interventions in the Classrooms, from Resistance to Action. Just to remind everyone in the audience, the goal of this webinar is to provide some behind-the-scenes insights into biology education studies. Therefore, I would like to strongly encourage everyone to submit their questions as we go. That's what really makes these conversations happen. So please make active use of the Q&A feature to submit your questions. I will synthesize the questions as we go and make them visible. Okay, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our featured author, Dr. Dustin Thoman. Dr. Dustin Thoman is an associate professor of psychology at San Diego State University and the California research director at the Motivate Lab. He leads the Motivation and the Social Identity Lab at San Diego State University, where his research specialties include student interest and motivation and the influence of stereotypes and social identities on the development of student interests. He works to improve educational programs, particularly those designed to broaden participation and promote diversity in science and math education. In today's webinar, Dr. Thoman will share with us a closer look behind the scenes of his recent and very important work on faculty members' attitudes and reactions to diversity interventions. Welcome, Dustin. We are very excited to have you today as our featured author.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Kong, for the very kind and overly enthusiastic welcoming and introduction. I appreciate that. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about our paper, and when I say our, I'm going to talk about this research team you can see on the screen. I'm a social psychologist at San Diego State University. I work in science education, and I partner with folks from lots of different disciplines. And so we always have a big team of folks trying to understand the kinds of questions we're asking in these research projects through a different range of disciplinary perspectives. On this paper, we have a biology educator, Dr. Milajin Yap. We have an education researcher focusing in STEM education, Dr. Felicia Herrera Villarreal. And then my longtime collaborator, Dr. Jesse Smith, also a social psychologist. This project is part of a bigger one, and I'll talk to you about that as we go on. For which we had a really tremendous advisory board that helps us shape things and fantastic support from National Science Foundation to carry out this work. So when we began this problem, it began from our personal experiences as student researchers. So we were trying to understand, how do we motivate students? How do we create improved pedagogy within STEM classrooms? And as we began doing this kind of work, we realized that there are lots of evidence-based interventions being created from education, from psychology, from DEVA researchers. But moving these interventions to scale is really slow. And so this is a different kind of problem than how do we change the classroom? We started thinking about, how do we get faculty to adopt these interventions at scale and relatively quickly? As we started on this problem, we thought about two types of barriers, which is scientific barriers, right? We know that evidence-based studies or evidence-based interventions need to be replicated, right? So it may work well at one place, but it may not work as well at others. So this needs time, and this is the scientific process. We also might need to understand heterogeneity. So why do particular interventions or pedagogies work better in some university contexts than others? This isn't what we were studying, however. Where we focused is on the implementation barriers. And we thought about the idea that, instructors or faculty need to get the knowledge that these evidence-based pedagogies exist, but then they also need to make decisions to implement them. And our personal experience, our personal experience came in here because we had been working on a number of interventions based in social psychology and education. And we would often describe these to faculty. We would sometimes ask if they want to participate in our studies. And even though we showed them evidence that these closed equity gaps, for example, at other universities, that these were really rigorously supported through RCT trial research, faculty were often lukewarm about whether they wanted to implement this in their classes. And this phenomenon, this experience of faculty being the individual decision makers in their class and deciding whether or not they're going to implement something that is evidence-based, even after they have knowledge of that, was something we wanted to understand, and we wanted to use our social psychology background to help understand it. So we begin with the assumption that it takes more than just learning that an intervention or an evidence-based intervention exists. Once you know it exists, what is the decision-making process from a faculty's perspective or instructor's perspective on whether or not to intervene? And we began with the social psychological approach, and have this quote from who's often considered a sort of a grandfather of social psychology, is Kurt Lewin. It says, "There's nothing so practical as a good theory." And I'm sharing this because the goal of this webinar is to go behind the scenes in this research. When we began trying to understand our problem, we started looking to older theories, older psychological theories that might help make sense of it. And we actually latched on to an article in 2008 in which Thomas and Plout used a model from 1978, the bystander intervention model. So the original bystander intervention model is looking at emergency situations, right? So let's see, you see two cars who hit each other on the freeway in front of you, and they're pulling over. You're trying to figure out, do I need to help, right? Do I need to do something in this situation? Well, Thomas and Plout took that to the workplace context. They looked at organizations, not academic organizations, but other organizations, to look at what they call diversity resistance. So when people put into place DEI initiatives, in terms of making the policy, in terms of following the policy, what are the different psychological barriers that pop up in terms of implementing those policies and procedures fully? So we used their adaptation of the original model and translated it into an academic context. From this model, we get 4 steps of decision-making inputs where people notice the problem, they interpret it as needing immediate action, people must assume responsibility and know how to help. All of these are consistent with the original emergency research for bystander interventions, consistent with what Thomas and Plout found in organizational contexts. But each of these take on a different kind of nuance when we think about how faculty make decisions in their classroom, which of course is different than employees in most organizations across the world. So the paper in CBE, which I'll talk about today, had 2 particular aims. The first was to examine the potential for our model to explain instructors' intentions to implement, and that's important. We didn't study, at least not yet, we did this in the bigger project, but in this paper, we had not yet studied actual implementation. We studied intentions to implement. And then to explore how faculty think both about diversity or DEI initiatives broadly, and a very particular one that we introduced to them. In the bigger project, we actually collected a nationally representative sample of biology instructors across the country. And this map shows where our participants were located. I could describe more about how we did the sampling procedure and what we've done in the studies since then as we get to the Q&A. But for now, we'll focus on the participants our earliest group of participants who we used in the CBE paper. Here we had 40 biology instructors from 8 universities. We intentionally tried to sample a range of locations across the country and universities. More details are in the paper. We used a mixed methods approach. So we interviewed them for approximately an hour. They were interviewed by a biology educator postdoc. We then presented them with a target interview, and the target intervention was the utility value intervention. So in the interview, we began asking them about diversity initiatives broadly, what they're doing in their university, what they're doing in their classroom. We asked questions that aligned with our model inputs, right? Do you notice underrepresentation as an issue in your classroom? Do you think it needs immediate action? Do you feel responsible for it? So we framed these questions broadly. We then introduced the utility value intervention because we wanted to give them something really concrete to respond to, right? So when we talk about diversity initiatives or DEI initiatives in the classroom, it can mean a wide range of things, which created a big source of variability in what people were talking about. So we wanted to hone in on one particular intervention to gauge their reactions, and we asked some survey measures about their reaction to this. So the utility value intervention is a writing intervention that occurs in classes. It's been shown to be effective in biology, and very recent evidence suggests that in chemistry, it's highly effective for promoting performance and persistence. In this intervention, students write 3 essays across the semester. This can be adapted to quarter systems, of course. In the utility value essay, students are writing about questions related to course topics. So they're writing about something that's interesting, they're summarizing the course material, and then importantly, and this has been shown to improve performance and persistence compared to control groups, they're also writing about why this matters to them. They're writing about relevance to themselves, to their career goals, to their lives right now, sometimes to their friends and family. So in this intervention, it's a short writing intervention, 3 assignments. It usually counts for between 1% and 2% of a course grade, so very small in terms of grades. It's offered by homework, so it doesn't take instructors changing their entire curriculum. It can be administered completely online, and it's a relatively quickly integrated, which is one of the reasons we picked it. So we included survey measures that were asked them about each of the 4 model inputs directly as they relate to the utility value intervention and whether they would consider using it in their classrooms. We asked about the perceptions of value and their intentions to implement it. The way I'm going to present results is flows by our model. This same figure is in our paper, so I hope this text is big enough for everyone, but if not, our paper has the full figure as well. We identify the problem as underrepresentation in biology, particularly for racial and ethnic minorities, in the case we're talking about now and where we focused on in this paper. And the first step in our decision-making input is that people must notice that underrepresentation is a problem. What we found in our interviews in terms of the obstacles to moving toward the action, so you can see at the top of the screen in blue, we're hoping that people move toward the action, which in our broad model terms is providing help or actually implementing or intending to implement the intervention in your classroom. The first kind of obstacles we help are social beliefs about what drives underrepresentation and what is the role of science in this space. Here we saw one of the common barriers was taking on a colorblind approach. So people saying, I'm supposed to treat everyone the same, and that making a decision to implement some intervention that helps one group more than others is not correct. That's not the scientific approach, and it's not what I'm supposed to be doing in my job. So we heard those kinds of themes emerge. I'm not going to go through every theme on here. I'm going to highlight a few because I think the real value of these webinars is the Q&A. And in the paper, we go into much more detail into each of these themes. But I think one thing you're going to notice as we move through each of these steps is that the social beliefs and the social information that faculty process from their daily life are a big part of what shapes whether they intend to implement interventions or not. And I want to highlight this because a lot of times we think about faculty decision-making as a very individual perspective. And in one sense it is. I am making the decision for myself, but I'm relying on how I pay attention to others and what I think I am supposed to be doing and what others are doing to help me shape that decision. So the second step in our model is interpreting underrepresentation as needing immediate action. And one of the classic decision-making processes or barriers to these kinds of decisions from social psychology is pluralistic ignorance. And what we found is that during our interviews, we would ask faculty, are other people doing these kinds of things in their classrooms? And most didn't know. And to be honest, this reflects my experience. I teach one section of a particular course and others teach other sections. I don't know what they're doing all the time. And so even if others in the university are implementing evidence-based interventions, if we don't talk about it, if faculty don't know that others are doing this, it leads to pluralistic ignorance. And if we think that other people aren't helping, we think that's the norm. And that's a lot of what we found in our interviews. And one of the themes that emerged is that people thought it wasn't the norm for everyone to be really focused on this problem or to be interpreting this problem as needed immediate action that needs changes in the classroom right now. So again, the social information really mattered. Here I'll also highlight that when we ask people about, are you doing anything to improve equity in the classroom, to close equity gaps? They often focus on broad, like, well, I'm trying to integrate some active learning. We would try to push occasionally on how active learning helps close achievement gaps. And the responses weren't always clear. They were often vague. And in this sense, people think of doing anything as a pedagogical innovation fulfills this other category of trying to solve equity gaps or trying to improve equity gaps in the classes. And I think that these kinds of assumptions hadn't been interrogated as much, in part because the conversations didn't seem to be surfacing in the departments of the people we talked to. The third input is that people must assume responsibility. And here we saw a lot of what we in social psychology call diffusion of responsibility. Well, you're right. Underrepresentation is a problem in my class. When I look out and see the class, I can see that some students are more visible than others, and that doesn't reflect the local population. But other universities have this problem too. This is the National Science Foundation's problem to solve. This is really, the university has people who do this. And all of those are correct, right? So all of those things are true, but they sometimes are also used to diffuse responsibility away from the individual. And when I say diffuse responsibility, I don't mean that individuals are necessarily intentionally trying to absolve themselves. It's simply they're aware that other people have this as a job to focus on DEI initiatives. And when they think about their classroom, that does not become the top priority. So again, this social information of seeing the problem as someone else's problem, or even if it is my problem, I might have some tiny contribution, and it doesn't shape the motivation to change how I teach my class. Finally, instructors must know how to help. And this is where just getting evidence-based intervention guides into the hands of faculty is incredibly important, but it's not enough. So we all know that changing our classes, changing the way that we teach requires effort and cost. And the kinds of barriers we saw at this stage were that faculty would blame the institution for not being able to support them. In the case of the utility value intervention, grading is a huge cost, right? So you're getting these writing assignments and faculty are saying, I've never graded a writing assignment before, so I don't quite know how to do this, or I need additional TA support to grade, to write. And when we look at our final obstacle to helping, one of the things we see is that faculty aren't always being as creative in the way that they overcome obstacles for teaching as they are in overcoming obstacles for their research. So if I talk to a typical biology researcher or biology faculty about, we're having these problems in our research, the amount of effort and creativity that they spend and that all of us as researchers spend in overcoming our problems is incredible, right? This is what makes for good research. But sometimes when an obstacle that is seemingly small from an outsider's perspective pops up in the classroom, rather than putting the same kind of mental effort, the same kind of drive towards solving that problem, it's, the cost is just too high. I can't grade all these papers. Or my institution doesn't quite give me the support for for the TAs I need to grade these. When in fact, we've seen some of those in our paper who are the most motivated to support DEI or evidence-based initiatives in their classrooms. They came up with creative ways. They said, I can make these no credit assignments. Does that water down the assignment? Can I do that? Can I grade this more quickly? Can I grade a random sample of the assignments and assign it an average grade or something like that? So you could see that those who were more inclined to think creatively about how do I solve this problem, taking the same kind of mindset they would for their research into their teaching, these kinds of barriers didn't seem insurmountable. So when I show this kind of model, what we assume is that faculty need to mostly sort of affirmatively support each step in the model to get to that action, right? So the idea of actually implementing an evidence-based practice that closes equity gaps in the courses. But I would say that in practice, it's not as linear as the model looks, right? So the model's conceptual, it's theoretical. It is possible that someone can jump right into knowing how to help, and policies can support them helping, I say support them in implementing interventions, even if they don't necessarily assume the personal responsibility. And I think part of where this conversation is likely to go in the discussion time is how do we support these, how do we use these conclusions to support department or institutional efforts for DEI? And here I think that thinking of the model as not a linear process that you can jump in and push toward action at any part is going to be part of the solution. So if we made policies that ask people to implement these interventions, that provide them a lot of resources to help, even if they didn't begin with the same motivation as those of us who commit our careers to this kind of direction have to begin with, we can still get to the action. And I also think that seeing the results of that action can feed back into the early part of the process where it may help them become more aware of what the problem is and that immediate action really is required. Some of the implications for our paper, and I think this is a broad implication, is that we can think of faculty as really gatekeepers for evidence-based interventions in the classroom. We often think about disseminating interventions at a broad scale. We think about institutional roles and the roles of professional societies. But at least in the classroom, faculty have a really unique status in our jobs. Because of academic freedoms, because of the way that universities are structured, faculty are the sole decision makers in their classrooms. In some cases, we have coordinators, but those are still faculty. Even either individually or in groups, they're making decisions at a local level. And I think it's important to consider psychology at the local level, right? What kind of social information do faculty or instructors have when they make these decisions? What are they assuming about others? Do they think they're the only ones in the department who care about this? Do they think that no one else is integrating these kinds of assignments and interventions into their class? Or do they assume that everyone really cares and that there's a lot of social pressure to be doing this kind of work? We know that getting information about intervention into the hands of faculty is not enough, that we must understand and systematically understand how faculty make decisions for implementation or not. And because there's such a growth of research on student-focused interventions, the only way we're going to get to scale in biology education and in STEM education more broadly is to understand the gatekeepers of that process. And I think this is an area that hasn't been as studied as carefully as the student intervention side. I think there hasn't been as much attention to it. I think there's some really fantastic researchers out there who have been paying attention to this for a while, so please don't get me wrong on that. But I think in terms of the money that is spent from National Science Foundation, from other organizations, the implementation piece hasn't been quite as much supported as the development piece of the pedagogies. I think we know a lot about what works already, and scaling is really important. I do think, and again, I suspect this is where our conversation is going to go, is that institutions can use this information to design really specific supports that target each of our steps. And we can think of institutions supporting action broadly, or we can think about really targeted supports. And this is where I think psychology can fit closely with biology education research, where we can think about as our model indicates, the individual decision-making steps and the different kinds of supports are needed at different steps because there are different psychological barriers. This allows us to go in a really targeted way, right? So we think about really targeted research practices or targeted medicine. And this is the kind of targeted institutional policies that can improve decision-making at each step. Okay, now I think is the fun part where we hopefully get to discuss. I know I went through things pretty quickly, but I think that the goal is to really talk about sort of the under the hood of the research, as Kong said earlier. And I hope I can share a lot more about the bigger project and the specific project that I talked about here today.
Thank you, Dustin. Thank you for the very nice overview. And just a reminder to our audience members, please go ahead and send in your questions through Q&A so we can get to your questions as soon as possible. And I have a question to get the conversation started. And it's sort of a reflective question about your motivation to study this topic. You have talked about that briefly, like in the overview, but could you share a little bit more about the larger context of this current study and why you are especially interested in studying like faculty members' attitudes and their intention to implement diversity interventions?
Absolutely, yeah, thanks, great question, Kong. I alluded earlier that it came from personal experience. So for several years, I worked with lots of colleagues, Chris Hulleman, Judy Herrickevich, Jesse Smith, and others on the utility value intervention. How do we design it? How do we improve it? How do we make it better for varied groups of students in different kinds of education contexts? And we felt like we had a really good intervention, right? This assignment really works. We felt like we had good evidence for it. I was doing a new study, also supported by NSF, on scaling this up at a pretty big level. And I would go out and talk to faculty about doing this in their classes. I'll say that I was younger in my career than I was now, and so I was maybe more naive. And I just thought everyone would see the data because I thought scientists see data and react. And that's just not true, right? There are lots of studies from psychology and from other social scientists where there's a gap between seeing data and action. Even though scientists understand data better than most of the public, I found that we would present the data and then a lot of pushback would happen in a lot of these meetings. Not all of them, some of them people were really enthusiastic. Yes, this is great. I see this problem in my class. I want to help. Others would say, well, they're writing about their values. That doesn't belong in science. They would say, it's just too much time for me to do the grading. Others would say, well, it worked at that university. It'll never work here. I'm not that interested. And the kinds of lists of pushback reasons we got really took me off guard at that point in my career. Jesse Smith and I were working together on that project, and it was then that we started saying, we got to make sense of this, right? For so long, our participants in our studies have been students, but when we try to put this into the real world, faculty are the ones who are really the gatekeepers of whether this happens. So it was a really use-inspired project in that sense, where we had to go back and think about what theory helps us make sense of this, as opposed to starting from theory and applying that to the world.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your insights on this. And I totally agree that we cannot achieve DEI success without like the active engagement from all the faculty members. Yes. And I have a related question like about faculty members' attitudes toward diversity intervention. And this may not be the focus of this current study, but I wonder whether you have observed any difference like in faculty members' attitudes and their intention to use diversity enhancing interventions between different racial or ethnic groups, especially between like white faculty members and racial minority faculty members.
So absolutely, right? We began this study assuming, based on data from what we know of who most faculty and professors are, that the vast majority of our participants would be white. They'd be from sort of majority ethnic backgrounds. And obviously the decision-making process changes dramatically. The lived experience, the ability to, we know from sort of lots of data in sociology and psychology that for white faculty, even being engaged in DEI efforts for a short time, one has the ability to step out of it and just not think about it for a while because it doesn't affect me directly, right? We know that kind of experience exists. And we know that resistance often looks very passive, right? So I might say, I really care about this. I really want to help. I'll serve on this committee, but man, that's a lot of grading. That's too much for me, right? I can be active in one hand, but the passive forms of resistance to DEI support are very true. And I think for faculty of color, that's quite different, right? So we know of lots of work, right? I can think of Ebony McGee's work on equity ethic and lots of others that focuses on both the additional time for service, mentoring students, driven to improve things in the classroom, that also come at a trade-off for time and time spent for what's often counted in our promotion and tenure packages, those sort of things. At the same time, there's research from social psychology suggesting that those who make it through the system as is don't always have the same kind of empathy for those who went through it. I don't think that's the majority of people, but in social psychology, when they were focused on gender issues, they call this the queen bee effect. So women who would get through business in high-level positions in business would sometimes have less empathy for the women who went through, who were going through, and talked about, well, I got through, so you should be able to as well. I think the experience is incredibly different based on faculty of color and white faculty in particular. I think that the equity ethic piece probably occurs more often, at least from the folks we've talked to, but both can happen. And I think the psychological processes that lead to those decision makings can be really different in each of those groups.
Thank you for your response. And in this study, I especially appreciate that you utilized both quantitative and qualitative data to investigate these questions, as we can get faculty members like attitudes from different sources. And one interesting finding is you mentioned in the paper is that faculty members tend to give mixed messages. Like when they respond to the survey items, they generally can recognize the underrepresentation. There's a problem in biology, and however, when you do the interview with them, they tend to give you mixed messages, and sometimes they even have misunderstandings on the important concepts. Could you give us more explanations on these mixed results?
Absolutely, yeah, great question. So first, I'll say that I'm mostly a quantitative researcher, and this is part of why I love team science. Dr. Miller Yap and Felicia Herrera-Villarreal led the qualitative interview piece. I could not have done that, and I think they did a fantastic job, and it's when we had these conversations in our team, right, comparing these results, I think our experience was much like yours. Why are we seeing these differences? What's happening there? Our protocol partly explains it, I think. So we began the interviews talking really broadly about diversity initiatives with faculty. What are they doing in their institutions? What are they doing in their classes? And so when you ask these really broad questions, you can start to see logical inconsistencies across people's answers because you're talking to them for quite a while, right? We're not talking about a 5-minute conversation. These were 45, 50-minute conversations. And it was only after that big conversation that we gave them the survey. So I think the idea of, or it was clear by that point that we really value diversity initiatives, right? That's why we're asking these questions. So once they get to the survey, it had been quite a while. And I think that probably biased their mean levels high. We have seen through the rest of this project. So as I said, we presented the first phase of data in this paper, and we've since analyzed some of the rest of it, where we gave out the survey data in ways that was not following a big interview. We're seeing lower mean levels there, but the correlations between the measures are matching on similarly, in the sense that what predicts value, what predicts the next step of the input is similar, even though mean levels are much, much lower. So I think people are really primed for it. And I think this means that we have to be careful with the way we collect data. That if you're asking a question about logical consistency, survey data probably isn't the way to do it. As I've grown in my career, I began as a fully quantitative researcher. I've begun to understand how much different methods answer different problems. And we never could have gotten to this idea of inconsistency across answers through surveys alone. In the interviews, it's harder to get correlations between things because you're asking people about those connections. So in that case, survey data are incredibly valuable, right? Where people are thinking about single answers, but you're looking at correlations over time. And I think the interview data were really valuable there. And again, I think when we talk about the consistencies, it occurred over a long conversation. I think we've all had personal conversations where someone seems really, really clear early at the beginning. And as the conversation moves and flows, we can start to think, wait, that's a little different than what you said up above. So even just think about how this occurs in daily life. I think you can imagine how this occurred in this interview. And again, we go into much more detail in the paper. But yeah, it's true that people just hold inconsistent beliefs sometimes, or they apply it very clearly to one situation, but they don't take that same logical conclusion to a different situation.
Good, great, thank you. Thank you for your explanations. And I know some researchers, including me, are interested in using the measure, like the survey measures you have in the study. And do you have any suggestions in terms how to use that measure? Like for me, I wonder whether it's possible to use a composite score to represent the participants' overall attitudes and the position.
That's a great question. So we did a lot of factor analysis and we did some quantitative analysis on those items themselves. What we've got are, for each of the model inputs, I think there are 3 items. And I will say that they do not hang together as a whole score. So each input's items, I think, really represent a different point of the decision-making process. We find strong correlations between each of the corresponding inputs, so between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, et cetera. So as you move along the decision-making process, those parts of the decision-making are correlated with each other. But for example, 1 and 4 are not necessarily highly correlated. So I wouldn't use them as an overall source. We've done some other work and actually came out of the same bigger project. It's a paper led by Jesse Smith and Peter McPartlin on what we call diversity resistance. And in this case, we actually have a measure of, it's a 6-item measure of diversity resistance at sort of broad institutional policies. I think that kind of measure captures whether faculty are, or I'm sorry, I said diversity resistance, wrong paper, diversity fatigue. So it's this is the sense that faculty are, in particular majority faculty, are supportive, but they're ready to move on to other business, right? So it's this concept that I can really work on this, but it can't be all of my psychological energy working on this. And I think that captures the kind of broad concept that you're talking about. It's how much are people supporting initiatives broadly, whereas I think the measure we presented in this diversity resistance to action paper are much more specific. And I think these model input measures, the more specific the context, the better the measure is going to get. If you're asking about a particular intervention, as opposed to DEI work broadly. I think the more specific, the better. But the diversity fatigue, the more general, the better. Yeah. And I think this is where we have to be really careful about our measures, right? Because people think at very different levels of control, right? We can think about really particular actions, we can think about really broad beliefs, and different items and different instrument tools pick up on those very differently. Yeah.
Yes, this totally makes sense to me. And thank you for sharing another scale about the diversity fatigue. Is right? Okay.
Diversity fatigue. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. And since we are talking about the qualitative part of this study, and in your overview, you mentioned that you also collect a large scale data, a national sample. And could you share a little bit more about the sampling strategies?
Sure. So we use all public information. In this case, so this first phase of the project and the data I presented on today, we really wanted to figure out, is our model any good, right? So if we had done all this interview data and the kinds of things that people were saying just didn't map onto our model at all, we would have had to take a big turn in our project. Instead, we found that people really helped show the nuances and that the kinds of social beliefs were consistent with what we predicted, that each of the model inputs were correlating with values and implementations as we expected. So we felt like we were on the right strategy. We then went and recruited a really broad national sample where we sent them information about the utility value information. We strategically manipulated parts of what we described to see if that would change, whether people would be more or less likely to implement it. And since then, we've identified a set of strategies that we think is helpful. And that was the goal of the overall project. So I hope that helps frame the purpose of that project. The way that we did that sample, though, is we didn't want to recruit just our friends or people we knew. Because of where we started in this project was, how do we scale interventions? And we thought, how do we scale this beyond personal networks or even just local state networks or people in the San Diego area around me? So we randomly sampled from the US Department of Education website. We found 40,000 institutions that had biology degrees. And I got to admit, that was completely overwhelming. We randomly sampled from that 40,000. So we used random sample generator. We pulled out, I think we began with 2,000 universities at first. I'll say higher education institutions, they were not universities. And then we tried to find who were teaching foundation level biology courses there. So we had staff and we had research assistants looking on public websites. So everything we found was public information. And now we have a large database of public information of randomly selected universities and faculty who we could identify from the website as teaching foundation level biology classes, where the utility value interventions are most impactful. So it took a lot of legwork, right? But if we think about how do we scale interventions, that strategy was pretty successful, right? So later on in our project, and we have some new papers sort of in the pipeline coming out now, and an essay on this approach under review as well. We described the utility value intervention to people. We gave them a handbook. We used the kinds of messaging that connects to the input strategies I discussed. And of the sample who did our survey, a very large percentage indicated that they actually implemented behaviorally. So in our larger study, we longitudinally followed them and got to the actual behavior rather than intentions to implement. And so when we think about scaling interventions, one way is to go through your personal network, to go institution by institution. But there's also a strategy of using public information, finding people, sharing it with them, using sort of messaging that fits persuasion literature and is sort of fits what we would know from best practices in psychology. And a lot of people actually did implement this in their classes. People we never knew, had no personal connection with. So more papers will be coming out on that soon with more detail. But we took a lot of painstaking time to just go look on websites. I'll tell you, the students in my lab did not love that project, but sharing with them the outcomes of that project, everyone is super excited about it. Like, I remember looking at those websites. I remember doing this, and them feeling a part of what we're trying to do is pretty cool.
Thank you for sharing these strategies, and I very much look forward to your future studies. Thanks. And the resistance to action model provides concrete strategies. Like, for the administrators, like in terms of how we can better design professional development programs to increase faculty members' motivation and engagement in implementing diversity, like DEI enhancing interventions. Like one of my question is, how do we reach out to those faculties, like for the first time? Like, and we know that like for like those professional development programs, those most of the time they are voluntary. So we cannot force the faculty members to participate in those programs. And oftentimes, like the faculty members who are involved in those programs, they already know the value of DEI. And how can we, so my question will be, for the faculty members who don't see the problems, like don't see the value of promoting DEI, how can we reach out to them for the first time?
I mean, it's a great question. It's a really difficult one. I think I have this general conversation a lot in the spaces I work in because everyone's aware of the problem. It's not an easy one to solve. At present, I think this is informed by lots of conversations with colleagues. I would approach it from two different ways. One is sort of top down. And this is my colleague Jesse Smith always says, you don't get to behavior change without policy change. And here you can drive behavior without changing the attitudes. So if, for example, university says we are identifying courses with large equity gaps, and each department is responsible for closing those, and we're going to give you supports for people who know how to close these and will help you learn how to implement strategies. Even if an individual faculty member doesn't have the initial motivation to improve their own course, the university has now mandated that they do something. And of course, that faculty member, if there's someone who isn't motivated, probably hasn't looked through this literature. So they're likely to do the thing that is both easy and aligns with their incentives. And if the support is provided for someone that says, here's exactly what you do, then you're likely to get behavior change even without attitude change. So we sometimes assume we have to convince the attitudes first, and that's not always true. Although you're going, in academic institutions, that's tough, right? You can have fights around academic freedom and classes and all these kinds of things. But if you make it outcomes-based rather than process-based, then help them with the process, that can work. That's a tense situation in a lot of places. The other way to approach this is to build in professional learning that starts to move people toward these kinds of values, or at least gets them to see the perspectives of students. I've actually got a separate project in Motivate Lab where we've created professional learning courses now. And we've had this debate around, do we put DEI front and center because it's what we want to be front and center, or in some of the places where we roll this out, do we place front and center the student perspective? And we're psychologists, so we talk a lot about student learning perspectives and how students respond to different environments. And after participants go through thinking about the student perspective for a while, we then link that into why those perspectives could differ based on where students come from, right? What kinds of K-12 environments they're coming from that step into the university, what kind of local environments, what kind of experiences they've had with teachers, et cetera, before. What kind of experience they have in terms of belonging on the campus and how that comes into the classroom. So we start with the student perspective and then help them understand that this is related to DEI. In some case, this is sort of like a Trojan horse style approach, right? So one is a very policy approach. The other is a Trojan horse. We move them along the attitude change perspective before you help them see why this is linked to the thing they were resistant to begin with. I think both matter. I think both strategies are going to help in the long run, but both are going to be more effective for different kinds of people and in different institutional contexts, right? So at San Diego State, where we have huge buy-in from the faculty writ large for DEI initiatives, we've been able to have those kinds of policy-based and outcomes-based approaches. That's different in different places.
Yes, thank you for your response. And I agree that at the support from at the institution level is very important. And as you mentioned, like in this current paper, that if the faculty members don't see their peer faculties are doing the same thing they are they tend to lack the motivation to implement the interventions. And in the paper you mentioned, and as well as in the overview, you mentioned that this resistance to action model is not necessarily a linear process. And could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So the model essentially begins with sort of knowing and valuing the problem, right? I noticed that this is a problem in my classroom. I think it requires immediate attention. But as we just said, I think there is also a path to behavior change that doesn't tap into those first two inputs particularly. And that's where you're going to have a heavy-handed institutional push. I think this is difficult, and it's not necessarily individual psychology based. I think that when an institution has a stronger push, you may not always get to sustainable attitude change for faculty. But if we're focused on sustainable behavior change, that'll get you there. So I think if we're looking at attitude change, it does have to be a more linear process, but behavior change does not have to be. And in this case, what we were most focused on was the behavior change of implementing the intervention.
Thank you. Thank you for the response. And I have a question, sort of a future looking. Like, could you share what will your next research question, the next research question you'll be interested in investigating?
Oh my gosh, I have 1,000 research questions I want to investigate. I think this is a good problem to have as a researcher. But I can talk about a few that spin directly out of this particular project. And one is that we asked faculty about the utility value intervention in particular. And the reason why was we wanted to narrow down into the specifics. I'm curious if doing one sort of evidence-based pedagogical move, sort of you're implementing something, makes it more likely to lead to the others. I'm also would really love to study social networks. So here we assume that one's social information and the qualitative data indicate that social information about one's faculty are more likely to change your behaviors. But we don't have direct data on, from like a social network analysis piece around what everyone in a particular department is doing. Is that changing behaviors? I think that even if people are doing it, if they're not communicating it, it's still not going to lead to behavior change individually as well. And so understanding how we support those conversations is really important. I don't think it happens at enough department meetings, at least not the ones that I've been at or I've talked to people about. It's not the #1 topic, for example. Also, we see some faculty, we saw a few examples of this in the paper, of faculty who were highly committed toward this and kind of wanted to hide it from the rest of their colleagues because they wouldn't be seen as researchy enough, or they wouldn't be taken as seriously if they were putting this much effort into sort of equity in their teaching. To understand the cultural balance there and how we change that, I would love to be able to do that. And I think other folks are already working on these kinds of issues, but I think those all flow right from the data we've been talking about.
Great, thank you for sharing that with us. And we have about 10 minutes left in this session. And my last question for you today is, overall, what recommendations do you have for faculty members as well as higher education administrators? So how we can promote the efforts in higher education and especially in STEM fields?
Yeah, so the biggest sort of writ large recommendation is to think about sharing what you're doing, right? Not brag, and share with others that I've done this, I've seen the data, this is making a difference. Because when, let's say a new faculty member comes into the department, if other people aren't sharing this, they assume that no one's doing it, right? And so this is the piece about pluralistic ignorance. If no one talks about it, we assume no one's doing it. And so we've got to bring these conversations out more in the hallway or over coffee, right? Now that we're not all on Zoom all the time, these conversations are a bit easier than they were a year and a half ago. So bring these to the conversation. For those who are leaders, make sure that you can push this idea that, underrepresentation requires immediate action and requires that we take individual responsibility. Help people understand how, department or university initiatives also require individual responsibility. And make the data show that you can look at class level equity gaps, right? If people think, well, they're looking at department level equity gaps, you can't look at my data, right? My individual class probably is much better than the department average. Without the ability to evaluate at the individual level, it's hard to connect to individual responsibility. So making it socially known, think about the social information sharing in your local department culture, and think about how do we get individuals to take responsibility. I think those are the two main pieces that we often don't think about in terms of pedagogy change, is the social information. I think that really stands out on it.
Thank you. Great. That's a great summary to close off today's discussion. And Dustin, thank you so much for the enlightening conversation and sharing your fantastic work with us. And to conclude, we have 2 more slides that Dustin is going to share. And could you, yeah. First of all, we would like to have all participants to open up the chat box and tell us one interesting thing you learned from today's session. I already see a thank you note from our audience. And this is a brief assessment for LSE, and your feedback will be highly appreciated. And besides like writing and typing in the interesting thing you learned from today's discussion, I would also encourage you to tell us in the chat box if you have any ideas or suggestions for other LSE papers, authors, or topics that you would like to see featured in the future Online with LSE. And Dustin, could you go forward? And please also mark your calendar for our next Online with LSE webinar. And this is not the updated information, but our next Online with LSE will occur on Friday, May 20th at the same time noon. Please check our website. And in the next section, I will be discussing a framework of social cognitive factors that helps explain students' buy-in to evidence-based teaching practices in undergraduate STEM courses. And I hope to see you here again. And thank you all for attending today's webinar. And thank you to Mark, Aaron, Ashanti, and Teresa for the invitation and the support for the session. And thank you, Dustin, once again, for your time and sharing your work with us.